Please, could somebody turn off the light for me? I'm going to spend the last 15 minutes or so, maybe 20, going over your some of the bibliography problems that have come up so far with the ones that have come in. We can do a little workshop here in class. The whole point of doing it as a draft first is that indeed you can learn from your mistakes and then sorry about that. There we are. Learn from your mistakes, and then by correcting other ones, you should be able to get better at that. And so I want to spend sort of like I said, probably about 10 of or so. I'll start. We'll shift gears into that, but I wanted to cover some material first for the class. Here's a sign-in sheet. Oh, I remembered this time. Oh, he's on top of things almost. Now that homecoming is over, we can shift our gears. Hey, we're sponsoring, the First Friday thing that Student Services is doing? We're doing something, the art department is going to be doing something with, we're doing a little printmaking thing on Friday. We might have you make a cylinder seal, right? A Sumerian cylinder seal, only with PVC pipe and linoleum and a piece of dowel, right? So I'm going to come with some designs for that. So I went and bought a bunch of materials. Well, I didn't. I had my department go and buy a bunch. I spent our budget on a bunch of materials to do that. So, I have class until about 5 o'clock, but after that, we'll do it, right? And it's a huge, everything else in my life right now, it's a huge experiment, and we could end up with bloody fingers and horrible things. But I got some Marymount blue ink, right, as well, and we'll come with some designs already for us to go. So if you're into that, and you did that last term, and if you did it last time, tell your friends not to throw their trash in the park across the street, because boy, after the First Friday, it was just full of bottles and crap. And I go walking there with my dogs every day, and it's just like full of junk. And it seemed to coincide with First Friday. So I'm thinking cause and effect, right? Okay. On Thursday, we were talking about Crete, Minoan Crete, in the Aegean. This island that was settled around the same time as the Cyclades, but had writing, and so we're not talking about prehistoric cultures anymore. And these people had come from Anatolia, Asia Minor, over here, right? This region there, and had settled on Crete around 2700 or so BC. But the height of the civilization was around 1700, and then we had seen that they were more or less wiped out because the island of Thera, just north of there, just here, had exploded, and probably the tsunami wiped them off because they're all right on the coast. At the same time, they had also settled elsewhere, including establishing a series of settlements on the Peloponnesus, this peninsula off of Greece. And these included all the cities you see on the map here, which are somewhat further inland, and as we'll see, quite a ways uphill, and seem to have survived the tsunami, the presumed tsunami, and eventually become really the most dominant people in the region. What we see is that the works of art that come from the Peloponnesus on your right here are indeed very similar in many ways to the works of art that we saw on Minoan Crete, because they're the same people, right? It was originally settled by the Minoans. And so again, we have wheel-thrown pottery with aquatic motifs. In this case, another octopus with big beady eyes staring out at us with a different kind of goblet here versus the storage jar on your left, from Richmond, down in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Right? So we see quite a bit of overlap between the styles of Minoan art and the styles of art on the Greek mainland, which is named after the most prominent city, Mycenae, which is probably best known from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. This was where King Agamemnon lived, according to Homer. And so we call this culture, we historians, call it Mycenaean. It's an offshoot of the Minoans, right? Related to the Minoans, but different from them. And in fact, Mycenae, after the sort of weakening of the Minoans, becomes the dominant culture in the region and kind of reconquers back the other direction, reconquers Crete. So we can see the extent of the Mycenaean realm in the map on your left and again on the Peloponnesus. And here's the city of Mycenae here. I got a picture of Lilith standing underneath that, but I haven't been able to figure out where I moved off of that. I got some Marymount students, including Laura's cousin, standing underneath the Lion Gate. So you get a sense of scale, but I've never scanned it in, and I got to do that one of these years because they were there on a study abroad trip, and I wasn't, so they sent me the picture, right? So anyway, here we see the city of Mycenae, which came to control the entire region after the island of Thera exploded. Probably, like I said, conquered the Minoans and spread all the way back to Anatolia. There's a 10-minute art fix online. Remember that you need to do those. With some of the review sheets, it seemed as if some people had just sort of skipped them and then didn't answer the questions that were answered by them. So make sure that that's really a part of the course material. So make sure you spend some time with that, right? But we talk about this fortified city-state online. Here's an aerial view of it. It sits on the top of a ridge with a higher mountain behind it. And as you can see, the approach to the city is winding up the side of the hill. So this road that you see here actually wraps around and kind of comes in this way. And it narrows down as you get close to the gate, and as you can see, you're stuck, right? If you're an outsider who wants to attack this city, you get this far, and if they don't want you there, you're in some deep trouble, right? Because there's really no room to turn back around and get back out again. And you'll notice that it's also incredibly heavily fortified with the natural rock abutment helping the fortification, right? And the stones themselves are about 4 feet tall, right? They're massive, massive stones. And we'll see some pictures of people in them, so you'll have a sense of the scale of these things. But the stones are so large that later when the ancient Greeks were writing their mythology, they believed that this was built by giants, because only giants could move stones of that size. Right? Now, they're nowhere near as big as the stones at the at the Great Pyramids, but just to say, right? So they really became part of Greek mythology, these ancient ruins that were left behind. Again, I'd mentioned that the city of Mycenae is in both Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, these famous works of epic poetry from around 800 BC. In other words, about 500 years later. And that means that this is in fact their ancient past, right? The stuff of their mythology, this lost time, if you will, from which they only had ruins. Right? Now, in it's not on this map here, but in Mycenae and outside the city walls, the kings of Mycenae were buried under man-made hills that were built outside the city gates. And this idea of burying people in these man-made hills was most certainly lifted from the Egyptians, who had been burying people in man-made structures, man-made mountains, and the pyramids. But by this period, 1300, is the new kingdom when they're using the Valley of the Kings. And they're burying their leaders inside caves as well. So those two practices come together and are adopted and adapted by the Mycenaeans. And we see here, and again, this is discussed further online, we see here the monumental entryway into the actual tomb itself, and covered over by dirt, so that from the sides it doesn't look like a tomb. It's like a mound of earth. And here we are inside the treasury, looking at that very, very deep doorway. Can you tell from this slide that the doorway is a good 12 feet deep, right? So you really get the feeling, apparently, of entering the earth, so sort of going deep inside. In order that the lintel across the doorway doesn't break, there's an arch that's left open over the top of it so that there's no weight directly on it, and that allows it to maintain its shape. You can't see it in the projection as well as on my computer, but there's a person, and that's where their head is. Right? There's a person standing here, and they're no bigger than my arrow, right? And just to give you a sense of scale, right? So we were looking in this entryway called a dromos, and again, this is reiterated online. And we walked through a deep passageway to this massive interior, which remains for the next 1,500 years the biggest man-made interior in the world. And as you can see, it tapers to the point. It looks like a beehive. We tend to call them beehive tombs. And it tapers up to a point at the top. It's not a perfect dome or anything. It's shaped like that, right? And with the way the walls bend, it means that every course of stone has to be carved independently. Every stone couldn't move to a different part of the interior because of the way it cants in. So it really is a pretty outstanding feat of engineering as well. I don't know why we're always surprised that ancient peoples could do good engineering. I think we think more highly of ourselves than we probably should. You know, almost every culture we've seen going all the way back to Stonehenge and beyond, right, have been able to put things together that we'd have a heck of a hard time doing, right? They built the pyramids in the time it took us to build Ostapenko Hall, right? So, you know, I don't know why we're always surprised, but we are. So we're seeing a cross section and a ground plan of what's called the Treasury of Archiac. And so we're now standing inside of this, and you can see that off to the side is a secondary. Sorry about that. A secondary chamber. It's just behind us in this picture, sort of off over here. And this is the actual tomb itself. This place that we're standing right now is simply the place for the burial rituals to take place. And then there was an antechamber here off to the side where the king would actually be buried. Okay? And these burials were with luxurious objects. Here is a funerary mask found in one of the Mycenaean beehive tombs. And you can see it's much more crude than some of the other cultures that we've seen, but it's meant to be placed directly over the face, this thin sheet of gold with these almond-shaped eyes, and an attempt to give us the hair on his eyebrows, his mustache. It always kind of reminds me of the Cowardly Lion or something from Wizard of Oz, the way his beard starts sort of below his chin, right? But you can see that what's flat now would have originally wrapped around, so those ears would be right over his ears as it's folded over the face of the leader. And this is to remind us again that there's this really dynamic interplay between these different cultures. We've talked about the interplay between ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia, but both of them also have a lot of fluid back and forth with the early Greek cultures as well, whether we're talking about Minoan Crete or Mycenaean, the Peloponnesus, right? Yeah. I'm pretty sure it does. Yeah, it doesn't sit out to the sides like that, right? But rather that it's been folded flat because I would imagine they don't want to snap at this point, although gold bends pretty well, you know. And it's fairly thin compared to tuts, right? Tuts is much more solid and obviously a lot more gold involved. However, when Homer, the great poet, wrote about the Mycenaeans, he said they were just awash in gold, right? They had a lot. Just much less survives for us, even for them. And again, it's all about grave robbers. What do you think people got all that gold that they're using in the Middle Ages? You know, probably from leaving things like this and melted down 6 or 7 times in between. So again, a very, very strong interplay of cultures, because indeed what we see is that the Mycenaeans are doing the exact same practice that the Egyptians did. And we know for a fact that they were trading. We have a lot of records in Egypt talking about Mycenae, talking about the people on the Greek mainland. And so we definitely know that they were in contact with each other. And these two slides side by side simply show us a nice artifact that proves the point. And also, just in case you remember, don't know your geography, it's not that far away either, right? So here's Egypt down below in green, and there's Mycenae and Crete up above on the left. And you can see it's just a quick quote right away, and these are seafaring people. So it should come really as no great surprise that they have contact with each other. And there's Mesopotamia, as you can see, not too far off, right, in the grand scheme of things, right? So just keep in mind that as we're looking at these early civilizations, there really is a lot of interplay. There's a lot of back and forth, transferring cultural practices, adopting them, and especially, I think it's important, adapting them to their own individual practices, right? We're not leaving them alone, but they're turning them around in the same way that we saw Egypt and Mesopotamia with the idea of the holy mountain. One's the ziggurat, the other is the pyramid. And they certainly, someone's influencing the other one, but they're using them to their different. Well, there was a Greek Dark Ages, so to speak, after the fall of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. And it lasted from around 1200 BC to around 800 BC. So there's roughly 400 years of history that are not well accounted for, where things had sort of disrupted for us as historians. And it's much more difficult to find artifacts from that time. And then around 800, around the same time as Homer is writing his great mythologies, we have a upsurge of cultural artifacts that we can study. And what's interesting is that many of the earliest works from what we now call ancient Greece, rather than Proto-Greek things, ancient civilizations, but the earliest part of Greece proper have quite a bit of stylistic similarity to the cultures that had disappeared. So if we look at this amphora is the kind of vase this is. It describes the shape, right? Right? I'm not going to say, which one of these is an amphora, right? But an amphora is a thin-necked vase with two handles and a wider belly and a narrow pit, right? That's basically what an amphora is. And you'll see 4 or 5 different kinds of pots as we go through. We'll go through a lot of pots. But as we look at this one from Richmond, from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, we can see, as we look at the side of it, that if you look at the human figures that appear here, right, you see they're riding on chariots with these rather stylized horses. And by stylized, I mean abstracted, right? But you can still make them out as horses. But the figures that are on the backs of the chariots, you'll notice we look at the body style, the body type. That there's a certain similarity between them and the ones at Knossos, at the bull leaping fresco on your left. What sorts of things do they have in common, insofar as the figural proportions are concerned? Really thin waist. Yeah, they look like they're wearing girdles almost, right? Tiny pencil thin waist. What else? Indeed, that upper body that's been sort of geometricized, right? Rendered as a simplified triangle, also appears in both of them. Anything else? Something that goes kind of hand in hand with the tiny waist, so you notice that they all have rather large hips and thighs, right? Really blossoming out at that area. And then we can add to that quite thin legs by comparison, which is true at the Minoan work on the left. And in fact, quite thin arms as well, although thinner here with the geometric amphora in Virginia, in Richmond. Right. So what is illustrated here? What do you guess that this is a theme of? A chariot race? Any other guess what it might be? How do we know it's a race and not something else? What else might a procession of chariots be other than a race? A war, right? Or a parade, yeah? Now, where have we seen images of chariots in sequence like this before? The standard of Ur, exactly, right? And I meant to bring it in, but the standard of Ur is certainly very, very similar to this, right? And it's important to remember that our original settlers, our Minoans, who eventually settled the Mycenaean area, the mainland, actually had come from Anatolia, which is part of modern Greece. So they had come from Mesopotamia, or broader Mesopotamian region, before actually settling here. And it seems as if some of the decorative elements may well have their roots in very early Mesopotamian, right? The difference is, of course, that we don't have any images of the dead trampled underneath, which could, in fact, give you the confusion that it's a race rather than a military issue. And I'll show you why we think it's military in just a bit. But you'll also notice that up above, just below the neck of the vase, you can see there's also a procession of animals, right? Horses with their heads down, as if grazing or something else. And that too sort of has some roots in ancient Mesopotamian works like the Varka vase, right? Or cylinder seals. But the difference is that our early Greek artists here are filling up a lot of the negative space. That's what we call the background area, right? The positive space is the area filled with the figures, but the negative space around them has been filled in. I used to do that when I was taking notes in class, right? I'd fill in my lines and I got bored. I'd like to start to hatch between the lines and whatnot, right? And the sense here is they're not bored, but they've also got that same interest in sort of filling as much as they can with decorative patterns. And sometimes it seems fairly freehand around the figures down below and the animals at the top, but sometimes it seems rather tightly organized, such as those zigzag patterns between the heavier bands that you see. Right? So elements of the decoration, excuse me, are definitely coming out of the inspiration of ancient Mesopotamia, but are being adapted to their own purposes. Okay? Coming up. Yeah, I don't know why I have this on the side, so the same pictures, but they're nicer pictures of it. So we can see it below. You'll notice the patterning beneath the chariots, about 3 bands down, you have that, what we call a meander pattern. It's meandering, right? This and the decorations that rely heavily, you see it on the neck as well, rely heavily on geometric patterns is why we tend to refer to these very earliest vases as being geometric vases, geometric styled vases. It's not that the vase is geometric, it's that the decorations are. Yeah, and there it is. I guess I had one too many slides in the middle there. So there's the standard of Ur where we can see the same sort of chariot procession down below with the figure riding high on the chariot. And also processions of animals coming from other Mesopotamian works. So I have it. Well, there's our nicer view of our procession of animals. So you can see it writ quite large, with again those geometric patterns filling up the negative space, especially those things that almost look like African shields underneath the bodies of the horse. That they don't like leaving areas without decoration. Almost everything is, in fact, very highly decorative. And there's our rams from the Varka vase. That would make a really nice comparing contrast, the Varka vase with this, because they have so many things that are similar in one way or another. And as we'll see, they're made for very different uses. Right, so we call this geometric, based on these kinds of patterns that we're seeing here. Right? Now, how do we know that that central band isn't just a fancy parade or a race, as was suggested? And the reason we know this is that we have other vases that have almost the exact same decoration on them, but with more decorations that help to fill in what they were really used for. The one on your right is in your text, but I thought I'd bring in these pictures so you get a sense of scale, right? Um, Imagine throwing that on a wheel, right? It's a lot of clay, right? And that's a healthy piece of furniture there. It's about 4.5 feet tall, right? You could hide inside of it, like Indiana Jones or something, and in the back of that truck. Um, and I got a closer picture of it as well. There it is, right? You'll notice that these two, and here's one from the Walters, also have the figures on chariots down below. In this case, the chariots are pulled by multiple horses in each of them, and you'll notice that the horse bodies kind of become one body with 3 heads and 3 sets of legs. And over here, the same thing on the right. You have a single horse's body here with the legs becoming this repeating pattern and the head there, just as we see here. More of those horses with their heads down below, and again, the same sort of geometric patterning and filling of the empty spaces that we had seen in the one from Richmond, also here up in the Met, the Dipolon crater. Now, both of these with the procession make it clearer that it's a military procession, because you'll notice that some of the figures have spears, right, which indicate, again, more directly something military. And that odd shape that the figure has, much more simple in the Walters piece, but also in the Met piece, that looks like an apple that's been chewed, right? It's a shield, exactly right. And we'll see it in other vases later, right? The body has sort of conformed to the shield shape. And so they are military men. And it's, again, quite simplified geometric style, right? The heads, especially over here on the right with the Dipolon crater, you'll see just this little strange little shape with an eye in the middle of it, But each of the figures is wearing shields, and then that certainly suggests that our chariot here is in fact part of a military procession, right? Rather, and it could still be a parade, but I think processions and parades, the difference is that processions not necessarily a happy thing. Can be, but not always, right? Parades are sort of celebratory. Why the hell did I bring that up? To talk about the filling of the negative spaces. It's something we've seen going all the way back to the Minoans, that there seems to be this fear of leaving areas undecorated. And with that octopus face from Crete around the tentacles of that wonderful octopus, we have all the algae and starfish floating around, and we have that same, there's a $10 word for this, horovacui, fear of the vacuum, horovacui, right, to the decorations here as well, and over there. With the Dipolon crater and with this one, you can also see a much more varied geometric patterns, not just the meander patterns, but we also have checkerboards and chevrons are the zigzags, right? On it, down at the foot, up above. And here we also have checkerboards added into decorations as well. So each one of them filling it up with this really lively decorative pattern that varies from piece to piece. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I see the point you're bringing up. I see 2 questions there. I'll tease them out and tell me if this is where you're headed with it. Even though the Minoan pot here is interested in sort of filling all the negative space, the bull fresco that we saw was not, right? And so the bigger question is, are there other works that survive from this very early period of Greek art that might suggest that that's something that's isolated to pottery and not found in other arts? Is that kind of where you're headed with that? Okay, very good. I just want to make sure I'm hearing it right, yeah? And to my knowledge, there's very little from this early period insofar as two-dimensional things, right? The pots are some of our best examples of what's going on. We have also three-dimensional statuettes, which we'll see. But those tend to date from about a century later, by the way, which is no small amount of time, right? You always think about it like, well, it's, 2,700 years ago, right? What's 100 years? I had a professor in grad school who said it was doing art history from the moon. You get far enough away, everything looks the same, you know? And we get far enough away, it's like, what's 100 years, right? Well, 100 years is, before the Great Depression, right? 100 years is still the Gilded Age in America. So, right, it's a big jump, and we'll see some of those. But what we'll see is also that the influence of Mesopotamian art and other cultures remains very strong in the earliest era of Greek art, right? So I can't answer the question about what else we might have had. There may be something out there that I simply don't know about that happens. I don't study Greek art except to teach you guys it. So prove me wrong. Go find something. Right? I dare you. Right? So same Horowitz coming up there. At the top of these two pots, let's go back, right here and here, at the very top. And by the way, a crater, right, describes that shape versus the form. At the top of both of these, we have a very similar scene. Can you tell what's going on in this image? Can you read it? A funeral. Why do you say that? It's the world's funniest funeral. Uh-huh. Right. You're absolutely right. It is a funeral, right? There's the dead body is laid on the table, and it's surrounded by standing figures on either side, right? And one of the waltzers makes it clear what they're doing, right? They've got their hands on their heads, so they're It's a pose of anguish, right? I can't do it anymore, but they're pulling on their hair. And what the Dipylon painter has done is to make that a little bit more geometric by simply making them squares over their heads. But the idea is that they're batting their head or pulling their hair or whatever in anguish over lamenting the passing of the person that's on the top of that bier, right? You'll notice that in the Dipylon crater on your right, we have what appear to be kids or something hanging out up there with him, with a wife and another child, I presume a wife and another child, seated at the foot of the altar here. I'm not quite sure if that's meant to be a figure or if it's just again, one of these things that's filling up the negative space. But underneath the altar, almost as if it's in front of it, you can see someone kneeling down, right? Filling up the space in the middle here. And in the Dipylon crater on your right, you see two animals down below. And I don't know if they're, the sad puppies of the household, or if they are meant to be animal sacrifices as part of the ritual, right? I can't answer that. But both of them show us that these are intended to be funerary scenes. So that goes back to the question of a parade, right? It's meant to be a funerary procession. And the reason the one on the right, the Dipylon crater, is called the Dipylon crater was it was found in a graveyard known as the Dipylon graveyard. And it was used as a grave marker. That would account for its massive size. And in fact, most of these geometric pots that have survived at least, seem to have all been grave markers. And I know it's true for the Dipylon crater, but I'm not so sure for the rest. They have holes bored in the bottom of the vase, so it can't hold any fluid. And the point is, we think that they would have poured fluid through it and into the ground. Right? But these are certainly, we think, most certainly meant to be grave markers. And they're all quite large. The Met one is extraordinary, right? But this one is also about like that. About 3 feet tall. Yeah. The pots are the pot. The actual pot itself is a grave marker, right? So we'd seen the use of grave markers going back in in ancient Egypt as well, where we had this image of the afterlife on their funerary stele, right? And here the same thing, I think, except that it's not focused on the afterlife. It's focused on that moment of passing and the sort of human reaction to it. I've been trying to figure out more about the Greek idea of the afterlife. And it's sort of like this gray nebulous place where nothing happens, right? Make your own suburban joke, right? When I lived in Portland, I would say it sounds like Gresham, but I'm not quite sure what suburbs we make fun of here. Right? Maybe something like that. Anyway, a place where nothing much happens, a gray place that's vague and not as lively as this place. And this, unlike our Greek images, which are our Egyptian images, which focus very much on a lively afterlife, this is focused on the end of his life, right? As a terminus that causes pain and suffering. Not on the list. Now I wish I was, right? I was trying to turn that slideshow list out so early. I could have said, hey, this would make a great comparison with that Peter of somebody and his wife, right? When we're talking about the afterlife, right? So these early geometric vases certainly meant as grave markers, right? And that accounts again for the size of them. Of course, the size differences would be relative to economic differences, right? Wealthier can afford bigger and nicer. Yeah. I'm also really quite struck by these snake-like elements that are attached to it. They're not meant to be snakes, as far as I can tell, but they're really wonderful decorative things. Yeah. Yeah, I don't if it's fired or painted. I don't know if it's just simply a painted pot or if it's fired in. Um, and I'll let you know, right? Next class, because we'll look at a lot of painted pots on Thursday, right? From later when the painting gets much more sophisticated as well. I need to find that out, and I don't know. I think my guess from looking, it looks painted, but it looks like it's painted green as well. Like I don't think it's glazing so much as it's just become part of the. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And gobe, right? Terracotta is a kind of a catch-all term, which means basically baked earth, right? Like panna cotta and cotto salami, right? Is cooked salami. So it just means cooked earth. But there may be a more specialized term for it within the realm of pottery. But I'll look it up and answer for sure as best I can on Thursday. More of that. Um, You'll notice here these are two more local works from about a century later, not used as grave markers. Amphoras were often used when they're not as grave markers. The shape of an amphora is a vase for mixing wine. They would mix new water with their wine, so they wouldn't get so wasted so quickly. And the Oinoko on your right comes from the word, the Greek word for wine, uh, and it's a pouring jug, right? And it's typified by the single handle with the sort of trifoil lip around the opening that was pinched, right, for pouring wine out. Um, so from the next century, not grave markers, these are utilitarian objects. And again, I think you can see that these animals that appear on them, on the right, we have that wonderful uh, bull with the duck or something walking in front of it, and down below grazing antelope. On the left, we have lions and boars uh, milling about. But you can see where you can remember what Mesopotamian art looks like and how much they've really picked up on ancient Mesopotamian art for this. They still are interested in filling up all the negative space. The one on your right, it's getting significantly more refined, isn't it? Those beautiful pirouettes. Uh, this area just here, for example, these rosette patterns that fill up the space are really quite lovely. And again, the linear decorative element of that bull's head is really beautifully drawn. Right? So it's getting significantly more sophisticated, but we still have, even 100 years later, that heavy influence coming from other cultures that Greece really does build on the paving stones that were laid by in ancient Mesopotamia, and we'll see in ancient Egypt. Yeah. Uh-huh. You said it a bit louder. I couldn't quite hear you. Yeah, very much so. It's and that's part of that is the scale difference, right? The amphora stands to about here by comparison, right? So it's about not quite half as tall. Yeah, yeah, totally. I think you're absolutely right there that it is. But again, I think maybe as much as anything, a scale difference too, right? Because it's easier to draw in great detail when you've got a large canvas, right, than it is when you've got a very small area to work on. But I think you're right that there is a move toward greater. It's always dangerous to do this because art doesn't always move in one direction, right? But we will see as we look at Greek art that the sense of refinement and the sense of naturalism is something that really increases in Greek art through the centuries. And as we look at that bull, in, for example, compared to these ones over here, this lion, I think you can see that we've gotten, despite the sort of decorative 60s hippie body that that bull has, right? This bit here, that the head is rendered really, really well. It's really beautifully drawn and with a great understanding about how animals function. And I think over here on the left too, this lion, which is standing up, you know, on his front haunches, kind of proudly and confronting that wild boar, is really also very, very closely observed. Right? So they really are becoming increasingly naturalistic. Also from the Walters on the left, you can see that their early human figures also show the influence of other cultures, right? This figure here, if we look in particular at the head, what does she remind you of? Egyptian, or the statue worshippers even closer, right? I brought in these guys because look at the way the hair is rendered, right? With that sort of cascading wavy pattern and those monster eyes with the single brow that comes across in that sort of V shape, right, or M shape, maybe lowercase m. Even the lips and the nose, you know, really, if I showed this to you and you asked you what culture it came from, and you said Mesopotamia, I'd say, you know what, that's a good answer, you know, even though it didn't. This one is cast in bronze. It's fairly small. It's only about 7.5 inches tall, like yay, right? And it's in cast bronze, which we'll see is a really important medium for the Greeks, is cast bronze. This is a very early figure, and in fact, it's a solid cast as well. It's not hollow like later bronzes. They hadn't become that technically proficient yet. Like bronze. If you don't have still bronze, there it is. What we'll see is that bronze is one of two primary mediums for the Greeks, the other being stone, usually limestone like this one or marble. And here we can see a similar style of figure. And by the way, who said Egyptian for her on the left, right? One hand bald and the other hand out flat. Yeah, I think you can't discount the fact that that Greece is amalgamating different influences together, right? And the fact that and they kind of misunderstood it too, right? Because didn't the pharaoh always have the left hand flat and the right hand bald? I think it was, right? And she's the exact opposite, and it's not on her legs anyway. And besides, she's not a leader, so the whole meaning of that benevolence and strength may have been lost along the way, right? Well, here's another similar figure where we have one arm across the chest, one arm down at the side. And this was meant as a grave figure. What happened in the middle of the 6th century is the Greeks started doing almost life-size sculptures and then arranged from there down. She's only about 3 feet tall, right? So she's not life-size, standing on that large block. And she is intended to be a grave marker. In the middle of the 7th century BC, the 600s, the Greeks stopped using pots as grave markers and started using human figures. Right? Now, this I think we can see an even stronger Egyptian influence with the one on your right. And I bring it in, we can take a look at them side by side, right? If we look at Khmer Nebsky, Menkaures' wife, You can see quite a bit of similarity, I think, in the way the figure is handled. If I were to ask you to explain the similarities you can see, what would you point to? The headdress. Excellent. It's not the same, right? But it's very, very decorative, just as Menkauri's wife is, right? Hanging down in what looks to me like a bunch of little sausages or something, right? Coming down the side, linked sausages. What else would you point to? The fingers, indeed, that hand is so similar, isn't it? Even though it's a bit big by proportion, you know, the core on your right is a bit large proportionally speaking. Anything else you'd point to? The dress, exactly. So the foot-length dress. I mentioned when we looked at images of the women that it was rare for them to be walking, right? Most Egyptian statues of women are standing still. Walking seems to be something that's reserved for the men. And here you can see that she's in fact standing very still with the one on your right. I think also if we look at the way that the arm is bent over the chest at a very sharp angle, coming directly across, but again, better proportion. It's not trying to reach over too far. But you can see it's been derived, right? Derived from that without copying it. And still maintaining some of those elements that came out of Mesopotamian art, like the large almond-shaped eyes, for example. Still maintaining some influence from Mesopotamia. So it's really amalgamating these things together. Right? So like I said, around 650, these sorts of figures replaced pots as grave markers. And it's not meant to be a portrait of the person who's buried underneath it. And that's where the title comes from, where the name comes from. Kore simply means young girl. And women's graves were decorated with these statues of young girls in sizes up to life size. And men would be decorated with statues of young men, right? But they're not intended to be portraits, however realistic they might come to look. It's interesting that the idea of using a statue for burial was something that the earliest Greek people had done. The prehistoric Cycladic people had used statues as grave markers. And now the Greeks are returning to that practice. It's probably because of increased contact with Egypt in the middle of the 7th century. And in fact, in Greek mythology, the very earliest sculptor in all of Greece, Daedalus, the father of Icarus, the two of them imprisoned, right? Built the wings out of wax, don't fly too close to the sun, and he does, and his right? He was born in Egypt. Daedalus was in Greek mythology. So they think of sculpture as having sort of arrived from Egypt in their myth. And we're sure that's what happened in reality as well. So this makes a nice fluid interchange, isn't it? We talked about these Cycladic idols when we were looking at her, and how there might be some pull that way. And now we're seeing it go back the other direction as well. Right? Again, a really fluid interchange between these different people. The difference here is that the original Cycladic figures couldn't stand up on their own. And you'll notice that, of course, we've abandoned that entirely. The Lady of Auxerre can. And as we'll see with the next statue that we look at, one of the important differences between our Greek statues and the Egyptians is that they're carved fully in the round. In the round. You know, right? All 360 degrees. And even though this one is unfinished, the Egyptians always left something behind them, like a plank or a board behind them, right? Carved stone. And this one leaves a bit more than normal, but there's always something back there for the Egyptian statues because they're backed up against the wall. But the Lady of Auxerre is, in fact, meant to be seen in 3 dimensions. Now, the male figures, same idea. They're called kouros, which is the male version of kore. And it simply means young man. This one's up at the net, and he's life-size. He's actually, bless you, taller than life-size. He's over 6 feet, well, taller than me. He's 6'1", 6'2", right? So he is in fact life size. So he's a male grave marker from the middle of the 7th century, end of the 7th century, and again, directly borrowing on Egyptian examples. This one's even closer in a lot of ways. What would you point to with this one? What are the similarities there? The stance, right? Walking as well, right? He picks that up. Sorry? He's got the arms, the muscles are treated in a really similar way, right? Narrow waist, broad shoulders as well. You'll notice that he even has his fist balled at the side, right? I don't think, can you see? I don't think he's got the nub, right, that we talked about before inside the fist, that little round bit here, right? Other things that are similar. The headdress, indeed, and the nemes has been replaced with this braided look that is in fact held back by a headband you can barely see. He's wearing a little bit of clothes, and it makes us very aware of his nudity. He's got a headband holding the hair back on his forehead, and he's also got a choker on. And I looked for what that meant, and I haven't found anything yet. The Met didn't let me know when I was looking through their stuff as to what that means. It makes me think that they don't know either, right? What the choker is all about. But it does definitely call attention to the fact that other than that, he ain't wearing anything, right? And this is one of the primary differences between this and the Egyptian work, is his nudity, right? The Greeks revel in the human body. They love the human body. And analyzing it, depicting it, right? Exploring it in the art. And he's sculpted again on every side. I'll see if this works or not. We'll watch for a second here. I'm going to move around and right? And you can see that as we look at him on all of these sides, that it's really quite well detailed everywhere. He's got muscles that are laid out rather firmly. He's got a good rib cage. The pectoral muscles have a single line underneath them still. The same muscles in the legs are emphasized in almost the same manner, with that upside down V over the kneecap that delineates that. But again, still, I think some lingering influence from Mesopotamia with those large almond-shaped eyes. And there's a couple of views. From the back, you can see, again, we've lost that backing board, the backing plinth. And you can see that from the back, he's fully carved. And again, very linear and kind of schematic still. The shoulder blades become these semicircular lines, right? Look at the muscles on his elbow. I think I have a detail of that. Look at how the muscles on his elbow are formed and how the muscles on his chest are formed as well. There seems to be almost a segmentation of the figure when we move to the transitions from one muscle group to the next. You get sort of sharp lines. And here it becomes that sort of stylized, looks like the Star Trek symbol, doesn't it, over his elbow on the back. That is unnatural, but sort of hints at it, doesn't it? Well, you can see we're getting more and more realistic, more and more naturalistic with these. And that's something we'll be able to trace further as we look at more archaic art on Thursday. What I wanted to do with the last part of the class is first, I'm going to stop recording.